Craig is once again the chair of the American Constitution Society and also does tremendous criminal defense work here. And he's going to walk us through some of these terms we're hearing and some of the criminality, what we saw, and what does it really mean within the context of our democracy and, more importantly, the law. So with Craig, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you to Forward Latino for organizing the event. And it's wonderful to be joined by such a distinguished group for our presentation here tonight. I generally defend people accused of crime. In that regard, I work in and among and across the aisle from investigators, law enforcement officers, and prosecutors on a daily basis. And a lot of that work doesn't involve simply taking cases to trial and fighting in court as we see on TV, but also working on the same side sometimes as law enforcement officers who are working with clients of mine to produce further investigation, and also in a collaborative approach with prosecutors where we work on plea agreements and figuring out what to do about violations that have been committed. I teach criminal practice at Marquette University Law School. Much of the teaching students to engage in much of the same things that I just discussed and referenced, the prosecutors and defenders of tomorrow, if you will. So it's from that standpoint that I have had a lot of opportunity personally, of course, to think about the events at play since Wednesday in our capital of last week and what we should expect to come down the pike, so to speak, as criminal prosecutions move forward. Next slide, please, Daryl. So, insurrection. Generally in the law, there is a tendency of prosecutors to want to go after and prosecute kind of the largest bad actor in any event or crime. And the president is potentially that person as it relates to the events of January 6th. And I've personally received a lot of questions. Well, can't we prosecute the president for the crime of inciting insurrection? And so I'll take an approach that shares my general thoughts with regard to a federal criminal prosecution. First, we should keep in mind that the District of Columbia is a federal district, and so the prosecuting authority for all crime within that federal district is the federal United States Attorney's Office, as opposed to, for example, the District Attorney of Milwaukee County, who is a state authorized official. And so all prosecutions related to the events at the Capitol would be brought by the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. When people think about whether the president incited an insurrection, you don't need a law degree to look at the following and think, gosh, that seems pretty bad. We had President Donald J. Trump repeatedly reference the term fight in his address to the crowd on the early afternoon hours of January 6th, referencing or urging them to march or go down to the Capitol and telling them you'll never take back your country with weakness. You have to show strength. You have to be strong. His personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, preceded that speech by telling the crowd, let's have trial by combat. Next slide, please, Daryl. So what is insurrection? Merriam-Webster or the dictionary says it's an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or government. United States Code, the federal law on rebellion or insurrection, and I've highlighted the key terms, but it's inciting and assisting any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States. So that would seem to present a fairly decent case potentially against the speakers on January 6th, including Rudy Giuliani, the president, and the president's son as well, who also referenced or addressed the crowd and others. And then to incite from US Code is to organize, promote, or encourage, participate in, carry on. And that includes, but is not limited to, urging or instigating other persons, but shall not be deemed to mean mere oral or written advocacy of ideas or expression of belief. And this is where things get a little bit complicated. Next slide. The problem is the First Amendment and freedom of speech. And the seminal United States Supreme Court case in this regard is the Brandenburg case. a late 1960s case where somebody from the Ku Klux Klan was speaking in Ohio, was prosecuted under Ohio's statute from the early part of the last century during the Red Scare, the so-called Red Scare, that criminalized certain types of speech. And a case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which essentially the finding was that the holding was that the government cannot constitutionally punish abstract advocacy of force or law violation. And political speech is, of course, the most protected of our types of speech, given the protections of the First Amendment. So the way that the analyses have been shaping up, at least during the last week, is that a federal prosecution against the president, against his son, against Rudy Giuliani, would run into the First Amendment and political speech, and it may make things difficult. Now, I'm not the only person who thinks that, and I'll quote a few people. There's an unnamed source from the Justice Department, and I think from reading the full version of this that it's somebody from the Justice Department in DC, but I can't tell with certainty. But the quote from the current Justice Department official is, "Encouragement can cause criminal liability, but it's got to be more than a politician making reckless comments to their base, especially because a politician's blustery or incendiary comments are still protected by the First Amendment," the official said, speaking on condition of anonymity. Jordan Strauss, who served in the Justice Department for President Obama, for the Obama administration, said, it would be hard to bring a criminal prosecution. According to federal law, people can face rebellion or insurrection charges for offering aid or comfort to rioters. So a broad reading of sedition and insurrection laws could theoretically allow for prosecution of senior officials, but the legal issues would be thorny related to the First Amendment, said Mr. Strauss. Now, that is the case, kind of, so to speak, against prosecuting the people at the head. It's not an open and shut question. This is not mathematics, this is the law. And so we apply the facts to the law, and various prosecutors and defenders see things differently. That's routine. It's important to keep in mind that there's a legal or criminal law prosecution question, and there's a political question as it relates to inciting insurrection. The political question relates to impeachment, which Professor Falone is going to speak to. Next slide. So what about these guys and the other folks? Everyone from the QAnon shaman to the people climbing the walls of our Capitol to the West Virginia legislator who, in the Rebels sweatshirt, was pulled off in handcuffs the other day for his involvement, broadcasting himself from inside our nation's Capitol, and the special gentleman who had a seat at Speaker Pelosi's desk and decided to take a piece of her mail and or possibly other items. These are, next slide, what we would call in the law people who committed substantive, or people that are doing real federal crimes, as opposed to soliciting or encouraging others to committing those crimes. Now, we saw the first wave of arrests made and the first indictments filed, and most of them involved kind of what I would characterize as lower end federal crimes, not unserious, but lower end. Things like knowingly entering or remaining in restricted buildings or grounds without lawful authority, theft of government property. Later last week, through the weekend and into this week so far, the investigation has revealed further evidence that is troubling and disturbing, revealing assaults of law enforcement officers, revealing attacks that are more violent than those things that were first captured when we were all watching the news of last week, Wednesday. And this is what happens in investigations. Oftentimes prosecutors file placeholder, if you will, charges. They issue arrests, and they have the authority, generally speaking, to file superseding indictments or additional criminal charges as evidence becomes developed. And in this case, there are quite a few law enforcement officers now backtracking and trying to ascertain the involvement of people that were at the Capitol, that were captured on film, and that largely, unfortunately, because of the lack of preparation by law enforcement to prevent or repel this attack on the Capitol, were allowed to leave for the most part. and to be caught up with later. And so that's the endeavor now. And so as the investigation moves forward, are we going to see more serious charges like seditious conspiracy or homicide-related charges, or charges such as assaulting a federal law enforcement officer, or aiding and abetting crimes like manslaughter for the poor gentleman that lost his life, or felony murder is another option. And the law, generally speaking, allows aiding and abetting to be prosecuted as fully as the person who committed the substantive crime. And so that's another consideration, and it's early yet to say what types of felonious charges will be filed against the people doing the things inside of the Capitol, the substantive crimes. But this is a broad overview of what I expect you will see forthcoming in the weeks and months after January 6th. Next slide. There's a few other criminal justice considerations. We've seen a lot of whataboutism. One of the first whataboutisms was, well, what about the Black Lives Matter movement, as if that were, as if a small amount of violence related to the largely peaceful protests were urged and encouraged by, for example, Vice President Biden at the time, which they were not, and which were disavowed by everybody on the, so to speak, other side of the political aisle at the leadership level. So the whataboutism is false. But people have also said, well, what about this? What about law enforcement related to protecting the Capitol during the Black Lives Matter movement versus protecting the Capitol or related monuments during the events of last week? And so these are questions that are legitimately being asked. At a very base level, the duty of the Capitol Police, for example, is to protect and ensure the safety of the people fulfilling the functions of government. That was a failure, and it's fair to ask why that happened and whether the prevention of law violations, the prevention of crime, is enforced equally in our society. Next slide. Investigation methods will continue involving digital data to a high degree because a lot of video is available from the Capitol events, combined with facial recognition and other even third-party or non-governmental organization assistance. Next slide. And I've had a thought as I've moved forward, and when I think about general criminal law topics, about the concept of general deterrence. I've stood with clients many times in front of judges and listened to prosecutors make arguments and judges impose sentences where general deterrence arguments are made. In other words, we need to, so to speak, throw the book at you in order to keep you from doing this again, but more importantly, to show the public that this won't be tolerated. And that you're really going to pay if you commit a crime like that. I've been a doubtful subscriber to the concept of the utility of general deterrence, generally speaking. I don't necessarily think the decision to commit a crime works quite that way. But having sat in front of benches for those arguments as they're made at nonviolent drug offenders often and responded to with large amounts of incarceration, it has occurred to me that if ever there was a time to pay credence to the concept of general deterrence, a very, very public crime against the basic democratic institutions of our country, carried out by those who have other proponents nationwide as a result of this fraud that's been committed about election fraud, this baseless lie that Ms. Jacobs took us through. This may be the time for general deterrence for those found guilty of crimes committed at the Capitol. Next slide, please. Lastly, I just want to close with this. The criminal law and prosecution of criminal law is largely carried out across our country with almost voluntary participation, even of the people prosecuted. In other words, people are summoned to court, they are arrested and released, and they come back to court. And we invest as a society in the basic premise of the fairness of our system. And what makes racial inequities and disparate treatment of racial minorities in the criminal justice system, or disparate violence against people of color as reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement, what results is a lack of trust or a shaking of that foundation. And the events of the Capitol and how they move forward and are treated by the institutions of government, our prosecutors' offices, our courts, are an opportunity to either add to that general trust and promote the public's thinking that we have a fair and just system, or an opportunity to lose that if they aren't handled with equitable rigor and perseverance with regard to the people rioting and participating in a carrying out of an assault against our Capitol, as much as they are for routine law violations across the country. And so that opportunity is there, and how it plays out remains to be seen. Thank you.